Dakota Territory, 1880. While his neighbors raced to finish their cabins before the first snow, old Nilsson was still building in late September, sawing boards and fitting joints for something they'd never seen before. A wooden box built into his cabin wall, 7 feet long, 3 feet deep, 4 feet high, just big enough for a man to sleep inside with sliding doors that closed him off from the room. His fellow settlers called it a coffin. They called him a fool for wasting good lumber on such nonsense. Everyone knew the proper way to stay warm was a big fireplace and plenty of wood, not hiding in a box like some frightened animal. Ole had learned different lessons growing up on Norway's coast, where his grandfather's timber house stayed livable through North Sea storms using wall-built sleeping cupboards that trapped body heat in a space no bigger than a closet. But here on the Dakota prairie, American settlers trusted open beds and roaring fires. Then October 15th arrived. The blizzard hit without warning, 11 feet of snow that would cut off supply trains for months and become known as the hard winter. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero and stayed there. Standard cabins failed. Families burned through their wood piles by January, sleeping in rooms that dropped to 30 degrees by dawn, water buckets freezing solid beside their beds. But inside Ole's coffin, his simple thermometer read 67 degrees, a 30-degree difference that meant the difference between shivering through the night and sleeping comfortably under a wool blanket. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat, space, and human survival that an entire frontier community had dismissed as foolishness? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Dakota Territory stretched endlessly in all directions from Ole Nilsson's claim, 160 acres of prairie grass that bent and whispered under winds that never seemed to stop. January 1881 had arrived with the kind of cold that made men's breath freeze in their beards before it could dissipate, and the snow lay packed against cabin walls like white mortar, sealing the small community of Norwegian and American settlers into their scattered homesteads along Willow Creek. The thermometer Ole had nailed to his cabin's east wall read 10 degrees below zero at dawn, but inside his single room, the air hung thick with the particular stillness of deep winter shelter. 7 other people crowded into the 16 by 18-foot space that morning. His neighbor Thomas Avery and his wife Anna, along with their 3 children, plus 2 bachelor homesteaders from claims upstream who had run out of firewood 2 days earlier. They stood in a rough semicircle around Ole's table, their faces pale with cold, and something approaching disbelief, watching as he moved toward the north wall where a peculiar wooden structure dominated nearly a quarter of the cabin's floor space. What looked like an oversized pine coffin sat raised on short legs 18 inches above the frozen dirt floor, its front sealed by a pair of sliding doors made from tongue-and-groove boards, fitted so precisely that no light showed between the joints. Thomas Avery shifted his weight from foot to foot, his boots making small scraping sounds on the hard-packed earth. His own cabin, just 200 yards downstream, had proven uninhabitable the night before when the temperature inside dropped to 28 degrees, despite burning his last good cordwood until midnight. His youngest daughter had woken with fingers too numb to bend, and his wife had found ice crystals forming along the interior log walls by morning. The decision to bundle his family and trek through waist-deep snow to seek shelter from the man he had spent months mocking felt like swallowing broken glass, but pride meant nothing when children could not sleep for shivering. Ole reached up and grasped the wooden handles of the sliding doors, each panel moving smoothly in grooves he had cut with meticulous care the previous summer. As the doors separated, a visible puff of warm air escaped into the cold cabin atmosphere, carrying with it the smell of wool blankets and human warmth. The interior of the box revealed itself as a complete sleeping chamber, a straw-tick mattress covered with heavy quilts, a small pillow, and along the back wall, an alcohol thermometer hanging from a nail driven into the pine boards. The instrument read 65 degrees. Anna Avery stepped closer, her eyes moving from the thermometer inside the box to the one hanging near Ole's table, which showed 34 degrees. The difference seemed impossible, but the evidence hung before them in 2 columns of red alcohol that could not lie. While her own children had spent the night buried under every quilt and coat they owned, still waking with chattering teeth in air cold enough to freeze their breath, this strange wooden chamber had maintained a temperature that would have felt comfortable in summer. Ole gestured toward the construction with the quiet pride of a man whose judgment had been vindicated by circumstances beyond argument. The box measured exactly 7 feet in length, 3 feet in depth, and 4 feet in interior height, dimensions he had calculated based on childhood memories of the skap senger his grandfather had built into their coastal Norwegian farmhouse. The walls consisted of inch-thick pine boards, each piece hand-planed and fitted with the precision of furniture rather than rough cabin construction. The raised platform that supported the sleeping surface lifted the entire chamber above the layer of cold air that settled along every cabin floor, while the tightly fitted doors created a seal that trapped body heat with minimal air exchange. A small gap of perhaps 2 inches ran along the top of the door opening, providing just enough ventilation to prevent stuffiness while maintaining the warm microclimate within. Ole explained in his careful English that a human body at rest produced heat equivalent to a small lamp burning continuously through the night, but only if that heat had nowhere to escape. In the open sleeping arrangements favored by American settlers, body warmth dissipated instantly into rooms that might contain 2,000 cubic feet of cold air. His box contained less than 90 cubic feet, allowing the same heat output to raise the temperature by 30 degrees or more. The mathematics were simple but revolutionary. Thomas Avery, who had burned through 4 cords of wood since October trying to keep his cabin's enormous air volume tolerably warm, found himself staring at a solution that required no fuel whatsoever once the main room fire died down for the night. His neighbor had essentially built a human-powered heating system that operated on principles he had never considered, not generating more heat but controlling where that heat could go. The previous summer's construction had taken Ole nearly 3 weeks of careful work, time his neighbors had considered wasteful as they rushed to complete standard log cabins before the weather turned. They had watched him select boards with particular attention to grain and thickness, rejecting pieces that showed any tendency to warp or gap. The door tracks required precise cutting with a backsaw and chisel. Each groove deepened gradually until the panels slid without binding or leaving gaps that would leak precious warm air. The raised platform demanded mortise and tenon joints strong enough to support 2 adults without creaking or shifting, while the interior walls needed surfaces smooth enough to hang clothing and personal items within easy reach. Every neighbor who stopped by during the building process had offered the same advice: build bigger fires, cut more wood, hang heavier curtains around rope beds. The idea of enclosing oneself completely in what looked like furniture designed for burial struck them as both unnecessary and vaguely disturbing. Americans built open cabins with high ceilings and plenty of air circulation, trusting in the endless supply of prairie grass and buffalo chips to fuel fires that would overpower winter through sheer thermal output. But Ole had grown up understanding that the North Sea climate demanded different strategies. Norwegian fishermen's houses featured low ceilings, thick walls, and sleeping cupboards designed to create warm refuges within cold structures. The principle was not to heat the entire dwelling to comfortable temperatures, but to provide small zones of warmth where humans could rest and sleep in safety while conserving fuel for cooking and essential tasks. As the morning progressed and word spread to other struggling families along Willow Creek, more neighbors arrived to witness the impossible thermometer readings and examine the construction that had become their community's most successful response to the hard winter of 1881. Throughout the autumn of 1880, Ole Nilsen had filled a small leather-bound notebook with columns of numbers that told a story his neighbors refused to believe. Each evening at 9 o'clock, he recorded 3 temperature readings using the alcohol thermometer he had purchased from the general store in Yankton, a simple instrument consisting of a glass tube filled with red-tinted grain alcohol that expanded and contracted with temperature changes, reliable enough for the precise measurements frontier life demanded. The first reading came from outside his cabin, where he had mounted the thermometer under the eastern eave to shield it from direct wind. The second measurement recorded the air temperature inside his cabin at shoulder height near the table. The third number came from inside his box bed, where the thermometer hung on a small nail driven into the back wall. Night after night, the pattern remained consistent and undeniable. On a typical November evening, when outside temperatures dropped to 15 degrees above zero, Ole would build his fire until the cabin air near the hearth reached 60 degrees, letting the flames burn down completely by 9:30. By morning, the outdoor thermometer might show 10 degrees. The cabin interior would register 34 degrees with frost forming along the log chinking, but the enclosed sleeping chamber maintained temperatures between 64 and 68 degrees. The difference represented more than mere comfort. It meant the distinction between sleep and survival. The mechanism underlying these remarkable numbers operated on principles Ole understood intuitively from his Norwegian childhood, but could explain in terms any practical man would grasp. His cabin contained approximately 2,300 cubic feet of airspace, calculating 16 feet by 18 feet by 8 feet to the roof peak. The box bed enclosed roughly 40 cubic feet, less than 2% of the room's total volume. When the main fire died, that enormous air mass cooled rapidly through the inevitable gaps in log construction, window frames, and door fittings that characterized frontier building methods. But the tightly sealed sleeping chamber trapped body heat in a space so small that a single human being could raise its temperature significantly over the course of a night. Medical knowledge of the period recognized that a resting adult generated approximately the same heat output as a kerosene lamp burning at moderate flame, though few homesteaders thought to apply this principle to shelter design. In the vast air volume of a standard cabin, that constant heat production dissipated uselessly. Within the confined space of the box bed, the same thermal output created a microclimate warm enough for comfortable sleep wearing only a flannel shirt under wool blankets, while neighbors struggled to stay warm, wrapped in buffalo robes and heavy coats. Ole's methodical record-keeping revealed additional advantages that accumulated over months of winter nights. Thomas Avery and other neighbors maintained low fires throughout the night, feeding their hearths with 3 to 4 armloads of split wood between sunset and dawn to keep their cabins barely habitable. Over a typical Dakota winter lasting from October through March, this practice might consume an additional quart and a half of precious fuel beyond daytime heating and cooking needs. Ole's system required only enough fire to warm the main room for evening activities, allowing the flames to die completely once he retired to his enclosed bed. The labor savings proved almost as significant as the fuel conservation. Cutting, splitting, and hauling 10 to 15 cords of wood represented weeks of backbreaking work for a homesteader operating with hand tools, particularly when combined with the demands of farming, building maintenance, and livestock care. Every cord preserved through efficient heating systems meant time available for other survival tasks, from repairing equipment to hunting game during brief winter warm spells. Word of Ole's systematic temperature measurements spread through the scattered settlement along Willow Creek, though reaction varied considerably. Lars Pedersen, a carpenter from Sweden who built furniture and millwork for neighboring farms, stopped by one December evening to examine the construction details and asked specific questions about board thickness, joint techniques, and door hardware. Anna Avery, despite her husband's continued skepticism, inquired privately about the sleeping arrangements for children and whether the enclosed space would accommodate a mother nursing an infant during cold nights. But the dominant community response remained mockery-tempered by growing uneasiness. Men gathered at the general store continued to joke about Ole's coffin, though their humor carried an edge of defensiveness as fuel supplies dwindled and heating costs mounted. The older women, many of whom remembered curtained beds from their own childhoods in New England or European immigrant homes, worried aloud that sleeping in such enclosed spaces might prove unhealthy, despite the obvious evidence that Ole's family remained robust, while other children developed persistent coughs from breathing cold air all night. The cultural resistance reflected deeper philosophical differences about American frontier life. The settlers who had come west brought with them assumptions about proper housing that emphasized space, airflow, and the ability to heat large volumes through abundant fuel consumption. The idea of deliberately constraining living space to achieve efficiency conflicted with ideals of expansion and plenty that defined the homesteading experience. Ole's Norwegian background provided him with alternative models based on scarcity and conservation, principles that proved increasingly relevant as the hard winter of 1880 to 81 began to test every family's resources. By late December, with snow depths exceeding 4 feet and supply trains unable to reach their community, several neighbors had begun asking careful questions about the box bed's construction requirements. They wanted to know about lumber quantities, joint specifications, and hardware needs, though none admitted openly that their current heating arrangements were failing. Ole answered these inquiries with the same methodical precision he applied to his temperature records, sketching dimensions in the snow outside his cabin and explaining the importance of tight-fitting doors that sealed completely while providing minimal ventilation. The resistance was weakening under the pressure of measurable results that could not be dismissed as theory or foreign eccentricity. Night after night, Ole's thermometer readings demonstrated thermal performance that exceeded every conventional heating method employed by his neighbors, achieved through craftsmanship rather than fuel consumption, engineering rather than endurance. The blizzard that struck Dakota Territory on October 15, 1880, arrived with a ferocity that caught even experienced plainsmen unprepared. What began as light snow flurries at dawn became a howling white wall by afternoon, driven by winds that reached sustained velocities of 40 miles per hour and gusted to 60. The storm continued for 3 days without pause, depositing snow depths that would eventually measure 11 feet in sheltered areas and create drifts tall enough to bury entire cabins. Railroad lines throughout the territory became impassable, cutting off communities from coal shipments, flour supplies, and manufactured goods that had become essential for winter survival. The settlers along Willow Creek found themselves isolated in a landscape transformed into something approaching Arctic conditions, dependent entirely on whatever resources they had managed to accumulate during the brief building season. Thomas Avery's cabin, constructed according to standard Midwestern patterns with 7 courses of 8-inch logs and a stone fireplace positioned against the south wall, began showing its limitations within the first week of sustained cold. The structure measured 16 feet by 18 feet, with a dirt floor that froze solid despite repeated banking with hay and wood ash. His rope bed, positioned along the east wall to catch morning sunlight, offered no protection from drafts that found every gap in the log chinking. During a typical night when outside temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero, Thomas found himself burning twisted hay bundles, corn cobs, and split cottonwood from dawn to midnight just to maintain interior temperatures above the freezing point. The fuel situation deteriorated rapidly as families throughout the settlement exhausted their prepared wood supplies. Men who had confidently cut 8 to 10 cords during the autumn months discovered that their calculations had assumed normal winter conditions rather than the sustained cold that would define the hard winter of 1880 to 81. By December, Thomas was rationing his remaining cordwood to half the normal consumption, banking fires early in the evening, and allowing cabin temperatures to drop into the 20s by morning. His children woke with red noses and stiff fingers, requiring several minutes near the rekindled fire before they could perform simple tasks like buttoning coats or tying bootlaces. The physical toll of sleeping in near-freezing conditions accumulated over weeks of inadequate rest. Anna Avery noticed that her youngest daughter developed a persistent cough that worsened each morning, while her son complained of headaches and fatigue that improved only during the warmest part of the day. The family's water bucket formed a skin of ice each night, despite being positioned close to the fireplace, and frost regularly appeared on the interior walls where their breath condensed against the cold logs. Washing became a hurried ordeal performed with water heated in small batches, and everyone slept fully clothed under multiple layers of quilts and buffalo robes that still felt inadequate against the penetrating cold. Meanwhile, old Nielsen's cabin endured the same brutal external conditions with markedly different internal results. His main room temperature followed the same pattern as his neighbors' homes, dropping to the mid-30s by dawn when no fire burned through the night. But his family emerged each morning from the enclosed box bed rested and warm, having slept comfortably in temperatures that remained consistently in the mid-60s. The contrast became particularly evident during the coldest periods of January, when sustained temperatures of 30 below zero tested every structure in the settlement. The thermal performance of the box bed system proved most dramatic during extended cold snaps that lasted 4 to 5 days without moderation. While neighbors struggled to maintain minimal heating with dwindling fuel supplies, Ole continued his practice of allowing fires to die completely after 9 o'clock, relying entirely on body heat trapped within the 40 cubic feet of his sleeping chamber. His temperature records for one particularly severe period in late January showed exterior readings of 32 below zero, cabin air temperatures of 28 degrees, and box bed interior temperatures of 66 degrees, a difference of nearly 100 degrees between the outdoor conditions and his sleeping environment. The health implications became increasingly obvious as winter progressed. Ole's children maintained their usual energy and appetite, while neighboring families reported persistent illness, frostbite, injuries, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of inadequate sleep in uncomfortably cold conditions. The doctor who served the broader region, traveling between settlements when weather permitted, noted that families using enclosed sleeping arrangements showed significantly lower rates of respiratory ailments and cold-related injuries compared to those sleeping in open cabin environments. Community attitudes began shifting as the severity of the winter exceeded all previous experience. Men who had spent months mocking Ole's Coffin found themselves making subtle inquiries about construction techniques and material requirements. The ridicule that had characterized early reactions gave way to careful observation and private conversations about thermal efficiency, fuel conservation, and the practical advantages of concentrated heating strategies. Several families began experimenting with makeshift enclosed sleeping areas using blankets and canvas, though these improvised solutions lacked the precision and effectiveness of purpose-built wooden chambers. The broader context of the hard winter provided stark evidence of the life and death importance of effective shelter design. Across the Great Plains region, inadequate housing contributed to hundreds of deaths from exposure, hypothermia, and cold-related illnesses. Communities that had seemed well prepared for normal winter conditions found themselves struggling for survival when temperatures remained below zero for weeks at a time and fuel supplies proved insufficient for conventional heating methods. By February, the settlement along Willow Creek had developed an informal hierarchy based on heating effectiveness rather than traditional measures of frontier success. Ole's methodical approach to thermal management had elevated him from village eccentric to essential resource as families sought advice on improving their own shelter systems. The Norwegian immigrant who had been dismissed as overly cautious and foreign in his methods now represented practical wisdom that could mean the difference between surviving the remainder of winter and facing genuine hardship as fuel supplies reached critical levels throughout the isolated community. The night of February 12th, 1881, brought the kind of temperature drop that separated experienced plainsmen from those who merely thought they understood prairie weather. Thomas Avery had watched his outdoor thermometer fall from 10 degrees above zero at sunset to 15 below by midnight, then continue plummeting as the wind shifted from southwest to northwest and began driving with the relentless intensity that meant Arctic air was pouring down from Canada without obstruction. By 2 in the morning, when he checked the instrument by lantern light, the red alcohol had retreated to 25 degrees below zero, and the mercury was still falling. Inside his cabin, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything he had experienced during 3 previous Dakota winters. Thomas had rationed his remaining cordwood to less than half an armload every 2 hours, hoping to stretch his fuel supply through the remainder of February. But even this careful conservation proved inadequate against the sustained cold. The fire he had banked at midnight died to coals by 1:30, and despite his efforts to revive the flames with twisted hay and corn cobs, the interior temperature began dropping at a rate that made sleep impossible. His 3 children huddled together in the rope bed under every quilt and blanket the family owned, but their combined body heat could not overcome the thermal drain of sleeping in air that approached the freezing point. By 3 o'clock in the morning, ice had begun forming in the water bucket positioned just 4 feet from the fireplace, and Thomas could see his breath in gray puffs each time he exhaled. His youngest daughter, 6-year-old Martha, had developed violent shivering that would not stop despite being wrapped in a buffalo robe with her siblings. Anna Avery, holding the child against her own body for warmth, looked across the cabin at her husband with the kind of desperate calculation that frontier women learned to make when children's survival hung in the balance. Pride and neighborly rivalry meant nothing when a daughter's fingers had turned white at the tips and would not respond to rubbing. Thomas made the decision that would later transform his understanding of heating, shelter, and the difference between frontier opinion and frontier science. Bundling Martha in the heaviest coat they owned, he lifted his daughter and stepped into the night, breaking through snow that reached his waist for the 200-yard journey to old Nielsen's cabin. The wind cut through his clothing with a ferocity that made each breath painful, and the snow crystals driven by the 40-mile-per-hour gusts felt like sand against his exposed face. The distance that normally required 2 minutes of walking became a 10-minute struggle through drifts that had formed and reformed since the last storm, creating a landscape of white hills and valleys that bore no resemblance to the familiar prairie. Ole answered his knock immediately, as if he had been expecting visitors despite the impossible conditions. The Norwegian homesteader wore only a wool shirt and trousers, comfortable in his own cabin despite the same external temperatures that had made Thomas's home uninhabitable. The contrast struck Thomas with immediate force. While his own cabin felt like a root cellar, Ole's main room maintained the warmth necessary for normal activities. But the real revelation came when Ole led him to the north wall and slid open the doors of the box bed. Steam curled out of the opening in visible wisps, carrying the unmistakable warmth of a heated room into the cold cabin air. Ole's thermometer, hanging inside the sleeping chamber, showed 67 degrees, a reading that seemed physically impossible given the conditions Thomas had just escaped. The difference represented more than numbers on an instrument. It meant the distinction between a child who could sleep peacefully and one who might not survive the night in temperatures that had already caused frostbite damage to her fingers and toes. Within minutes of being placed inside the box bed alongside Ole's own children, Martha's shivering stopped. The enclosed space, warmed by the combined body heat of 4 children and insulated by inch-thick pine boards fitted with precision joinery, created a microclimate that effectively transported its occupants to a different season. Thomas watched his daughter's face lose the gray pallor that had frightened him into making the dangerous trek through the blizzard, her breathing becoming deep and regular as the warmth penetrated through layers of clothing that had proven inadequate in his own cabin. The physics of the situation became clear through direct comparison rather than theoretical explanation. Ola's main cabin room contained the same volume of cold air as Thomas's home, maintained the same inadequate temperature when no fire burned, and suffered from the same gaps and drafts that characterized log construction throughout the settlement. But the box bed created an independent thermal environment that operated according to different principles entirely. The 40 cubic feet of airspace could be warmed by human body heat alone, while the tight-fitting doors prevented that warmth from dissipating into the larger cold room. Thomas spent the remainder of that night on a chair beside Ole's table, listening to the wind howl outside while 4 children slept comfortably in a space that his neighbors had mocked as a coffin just months earlier. The irony was not lost on him. The structure designed for the dead had become the most effective life preservation system in their community. Every few hours he checked the thermometers, confirming that the same pattern held throughout the night. Exterior temperatures near 30 below, cabin air in the low 30s, box bed interior in the mid-60s. By dawn, when the wind finally began to moderate and the temperature stabilized at 22 below zero, Thomas had observed a demonstration that would reshape his approach to frontier survival. His daughter emerged from the box bed healthy and rested, showing no signs of the hypothermia symptoms that had terrified her parents just hours earlier. The contrast with his own family's condition, exhausted, cold, and increasingly susceptible to the respiratory ailments that plagued poorly heated homes, provided evidence that could not be dismissed or rationalized away. The walk back to his own cabin through the morning light revealed the broader implications of what he had witnessed. Other families along Willow Creek were emerging from similar nights of inadequate heating and dangerous cold, their children showing the same signs of exhaustion and cold exposure that had driven Thomas to seek help. The community's collective approach to winter shelter, based on assumptions about American building practices and abundant fuel supplies, had failed a basic test of survival when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Word of Martha's rescue spread through the settlement within days, carried by neighbors who had faced their own struggles during the same brutal night. The story transformed Ole's reputation from village eccentric to essential resource, but more importantly, it demonstrated the life and death significance of understanding heat, space, and the principles that separated effective shelter from mere shelter that looked conventional and proper. The transformation of community attitudes toward Ole's box bed began with Lars Pedersen's careful measurements in the spring of 1881. The Swedish carpenter had survived the hard winter by improvising canvas partitions around his sleeping area, but the makeshift arrangement had provided only marginal improvement over open cabin conditions. When the weather moderated enough for construction work, Lars became the first neighbor to request detailed specifications for building a proper enclosed sleeping chamber. He spent 2 days at Ole's cabin, taking precise measurements with his folding ruler and making sketches that captured every joint, angle, and hardware detail. The dimensions Lars recorded would become the standard pattern repeated across the settlement: 7 feet 2 inches in length to accommodate tall men, 3 feet 4 inches in depth to allow comfortable side sleeping, and 4 feet 1 inch in interior height, providing adequate headroom for sitting up while minimizing air volume. The raised platform required posts of precisely 18 inches to lift the sleeping surface above the cold air layer that settled along every cabin floor, while the wall thickness of 1 inch proved optimal for structural strength without excessive lumber consumption. Most critically, Lars documented the door construction that made the system effective. Tongue and groove boards fitted so tightly that no light showed between the joints, running in tracks cut with mathematical precision to ensure smooth operation without air gaps. By the building season of 1882, 6 cabins along Willow Creek incorporated enclosed sleeping chambers based on Lars's specifications. Thomas Avery, despite his initial skepticism, commissioned the most elaborate version, a double box bed built into his north wall that could accommodate his entire family during the coldest nights. The construction required 2 weeks of careful work, with Lars personally overseeing the door fitting and ventilation gap that would determine the system's thermal performance. Anna Avery insisted on interior dimensions slightly larger than Ole's original, creating sleeping space for 4 people while maintaining the crucial ratio of air volume to body heat. That made the design effective. The fuel savings documented during the winter of 1882 to 83 provided compelling economic evidence for the innovation's value. Families using box beds reported reducing their nighttime wood consumption by 3 to 4 cords per winter season, a savings that represented weeks of cutting and hauling labor. Thomas Avery, who had previously burned 15 cords annually to maintain minimal cabin heating, found that his consumption dropped to 11 cords while achieving superior comfort levels. The mathematics were straightforward enough for any homesteader to calculate. Every cord preserved meant $20 to $30 in labor value that could be applied to other essential tasks. More significantly, the health improvements observed during the second winter of widespread adoption convinced even the most traditional families to consider the innovation. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who served the broader region from his base in Yankton, noted during his spring rounds that families using enclosed sleeping arrangements showed markedly lower rates of respiratory ailments, frostbite injuries, and the chronic fatigue associated with inadequate rest in cold conditions. Children who had previously suffered from persistent winter coughs and frequent illness demonstrated improved vigor and resistance to common ailments. The technical principles underlying the box bed's effectiveness became clearer as more families gained experience with the system. The key insight involved understanding heat as a resource that could be managed through space control rather than fuel consumption. A human body at rest generated approximately 60 watts of thermal output, equivalent to a small kerosene lamp burning continuously through the night. In a standard cabin containing 2,300 cubic feet of air, that heat dissipated uselessly into the enormous cold mass. Within the 40 cubic feet of an enclosed sleeping chamber, the same thermal output could raise temperatures by 30 to 35 degrees above ambient conditions. The success of the box bed innovation attracted attention from homesteaders throughout Dakota Territory as word spread through the informal networks that connected scattered settlements. Visitors arriving during the summers of 1882 and 1883 specifically requested demonstrations of the system, taking measurements, and asking detailed questions about construction techniques. Several families from communities 50 miles away hired Lars Pedersen to build box beds in their own cabins, creating a modest but steady demand for his specialized carpentry skills. The cultural implications of the innovation's adoption proved as significant as its practical benefits. The initial mockery directed at Ole's foreign building methods gave way to recognition that European immigrant traditions often contained solutions to American frontier challenges. Older settlers who had dismissed Norwegian, Swedish, and German approaches to shelter design began acknowledging that different climates and resource conditions had produced building techniques worth studying and adapting. Anna Avery emerged as one of the most effective advocates for enclosed sleeping chambers, sharing her family's experience with other women in the community and providing practical advice about bedding arrangements, ventilation management, and the daily routines that made the system most effective. Her testimony carried particular weight because she had initially opposed the innovation as unhealthy and unnecessary, making her conversion to enthusiastic support all the more convincing to skeptical neighbors. By 1884, the box bed had become sufficiently established in local building practice that new homesteaders arriving in the area routinely inquired about including such chambers in their cabin designs. The innovation no longer represented foreign eccentricity, but rather evolved frontier wisdom adapted to regional conditions. Carpenters throughout the territory had learned the essential specifications, and lumber yards began stocking the tongue-and-groove boards and sliding door hardware that the system required. Ole Nielsen, who had endured months of ridicule for his unconventional approach to winter shelter, found himself regarded as a practical innovator whose careful observation and methodical testing had produced genuine improvements in frontier living conditions. His temperature records, maintained throughout 4 winters of box bed operation, provided the documentation that convinced skeptics and guided successful replication of the system. The notebooks filled with 3-column temperature readings became a kind of technical manual that demonstrated the measurable advantages of controlled space heating over conventional fuel-intensive approaches. The legacy of the hard winter box bed extended beyond the immediate community as the innovation spread through the networks of correspondence and family connections that linked frontier settlements across the northern plains. What had begun as one Norwegian immigrant's application of Old World building traditions evolved into a recognized solution to New World heating challenges, proving that effective frontier adaptation required both traditional knowledge and willingness to challenge established American building practices.